Princess Catherine, known warmly to the world as Kate, stood at the entrance of Windsor Castle on a cold Tuesday morning. The sky was pale gray, the kind of gray that makes everything feel heavy, the air, the silence, even the breath in your chest. She was wearing a deep navy coat, her hair pulled back neatly, her eyes carrying something that was hard to read at a glance. Those who knew her well, however, could see it plainly. She was holding herself together by sheer will. It had been announced only days before that she would be stepping back from her public duties for a short period. The palace had released a careful, measured statement, one of those official announcements that says everything important between the lines. The public had questions, and the media had theories, but Kate herself remained composed, as she always did, walking through each day with quiet dignity. She had spent years learning how to carry difficulty without showing it, and on this particular morning, that skill was being tested more than most people realized. On that Tuesday morning, she was saying goodbye, not just to a schedule or a calendar of events, but to something far deeper, to a version of herself that had shown up every single day, smiled when she was exhausted, spoken gently when she was in pain, and stood tall when all she wanted to do was sit down somewhere quiet and rest. It was the kind of farewell that nobody outside could fully understand, because it was not just about going somewhere. It was about finally allowing herself to stop. That is a harder thing to do than it sounds, for a person who has spent so long believing that stopping is not an option. King Charles was there. He stood a few steps back from the small gathering in the courtyard, not intruding but not absent either. His presence was deliberate, the presence of a man who had watched his daughter-in-law carry more than any one person should carry, and who had come to acknowledge it without making a scene. He was dressed formally, as he always was in public settings, but there was something in his posture that was different from his usual official composure. His shoulders were not squared in the way they are during state engagements. They were slightly rounded, the way shoulders get when a person is trying not to feel too much and failing anyway. He was not performing anything. He was simply present. He watched her. That was the word, watched, not glanced, not observed in a ceremonial way. He watched Kate the way people watch someone they have come to admire deeply, knowing they are witnessing something they will carry with them for a long time. There were no cameras capturing this particular angle of his expression. This was real. This was private, even though it was happening in a place that never quite allows for genuine privacy. Kate spoke to the staff first. She moved slowly along a small gathering of people, palace staff, some of whom had worked at Windsor for decades, some of whom were newer faces who had come to know her only in recent months. She said something to each of them. Nobody reported the exact words, but every person who was there described the same thing. She made each person feel seen. A word here, a touch on the arm there, a look in the eyes that said, "I see you, not just you see me." That had always been her way. It was the thing that set her apart from so many others in her position. She never walked past a person as though they were part of the scenery. One of the older members of staff, a woman who had worked at Windsor for over 20 years, was seen pressing her fingers to her mouth as Kate passed. She didn't make a sound. She just stood there trying quietly to hold something in. Kate noticed. She paused, placed her hand over the woman's briefly, and said something so quiet that nobody else in the courtyard could hear it. Whatever it was, the woman nodded once slowly and seemed to breathe again. That small moment, two women standing together in a cold courtyard, one saying something real, one receiving it, was the kind of thing that does not make official records, but lives in the memory of everyone who witnessed it. There were children in the courtyard as well. Children of some of the staff, brought along that morning for reasons that were not entirely explained, but felt entirely right, as though someone had quietly understood that Kate's final morning should have some of that in it. The uncomplicated presence of young people who hadn't yet learned to hold their feelings at a distance. Kate's face changed when she reached them. The composed, careful expression she had been wearing softened into something more natural, more like the person she was when the world wasn't watching quite so closely. She crouched down, which takes real effort in a formal coat on a cold morning, and spoke to them at eye level. She always did this. It was not a performance and never had been. It was a habit, a belief, a way of moving through the world that said every person in front of me deserves my full attention, regardless of how old they are or what title they carry. The children responded to her the way children always respond to genuine warmth, openly, without reservation, without the cautious reading of a situation that adults do before deciding how much of themselves to give. One small boy held out something toward her. A drawing, folded roughly into a small square the way only children fold things, with complete confidence and no concern for neatness. She took it with both hands, which is the respectful and careful way to receive something offered by a child. She looked at it for a real amount of time, not the polite glance that people sometimes give gifts they don't intend to think about again, but a genuine look, the kind that tries to understand what the person who made it was trying to say. Then she looked at the boy and said something that made him smile so wide that 3 adults standing nearby smiled reflexively, the way people do when joy is too visible to simply walk past. King Charles moved slightly closer at this point, not close enough to interrupt, but close enough that those present noticed the shift. He was watching the children, watching Kate with the children, and the expression on his face was one that very few people had seen on him in a long time, something soft, something that did not belong to his public role. Something that looked very much like gratitude, and underneath the gratitude, something older and quieter that might have been love of a particular kind. The kind that is not romantic, not paternal, but something adjacent to both. The love of one person for another who has shown them something true about human goodness. The goodbyes continued through the morning. There were representatives from several of the organizations that Kate had championed over the years: mental health charities, early childhood development programs, community arts initiatives that had received attention and support largely because she had stood beside them and used her platform to say these things matter. Quietly and without the gathering being announced publicly, representatives from some of these organizations had been invited to attend. Not for photographs, not for press releases, simply to be there to mark the moment and to let her know that the work she had done would continue in her absence and that she would not be forgotten by the people whose lives had been changed by it. One woman representing a mental health support network that Kate had spent years helping elevate into public awareness stepped forward when it was her turn. She didn't say much. She held out her hand and Kate took it, and then the woman said simply and directly without ceremony, "You gave people permission to speak." That was it. That was the whole of it. Kate looked at her for a long moment, and something crossed her face, a brief and honest flicker of emotion that she quickly, gently brought back under control. But it was there. Everyone standing close enough to see it knew it was there, and nobody pretended otherwise. King Charles had shifted position again. He was standing now at a small distance to Kate's right, and his hands were clasped behind his back. Anyone who has observed him closely over many years knows what that posture signals. When he is performing a public role, his hands are at his sides or in a specific ceremonial position. When he is genuinely moved by something and choosing not to make a display of it, his hands go behind his back, hidden away, as if containing something that might otherwise show itself. On this morning, without exception, his hands were behind his back. The moment that those present would describe most often in the days that followed was not a dramatic one. It was small, the way the most important things usually tend to be. Kate had finished her goodbyes. She was preparing to walk toward the waiting car. She paused. She turned back once and looked at Windsor Castle, at the walls, the windows, the solid and enduring weight of it, the way it stood there as it had always stood, indifferent to everything that happened in its shadow, and yet somehow the witness to all of it. It was a brief look. 5 seconds, perhaps 7. But it was the kind of look that holds 1,000 unspoken things inside it: memory and recognition, and the particular feeling of leaving a place that has been home in ways that cannot be fully explained. King Charles saw it. He was standing at an angle where he could see her face in that moment, and he saw exactly what she was carrying in that look. He took 2 steps forward, just 2, and he placed his hand briefly, gently on her arm. She turned to him. He said something low and quiet that nobody else could hear. She looked at him, and her composure, which had held so firmly and so admirably through the entire length of that morning, shifted just for a second. Her eyes filled. She blinked. Once, twice, and then she nodded, slowly, with the weight of someone accepting something they have been offered that they did not know they needed. He nodded back. That was the farewell between them. No long speech, no formal exchange, no carefully worded statement for later. Just 2 people standing in a courtyard, acknowledging something too large for words with something too small to photograph properly. Because sometimes when a feeling is genuine and big, the only container that fits it is something very, very small. She walked to the car. The door was held open. She paused at the threshold, turned one final time, and looked back, not at the castle this time, but at the people, at the faces standing in the cold gray morning watching her go. She raised her hand. Not in a formal royal wave, not in the practiced gesture of public appearances, but in something much simpler and much more honest. Something almost private, the way you wave goodbye to people you trust rather than people you serve. And then she was gone. King Charles stood in the courtyard for a moment after the car had disappeared from view. He did not walk away immediately. He stood there, hands still behind his back, looking at the space where she had been. One of his aides said something quietly near him. He answered without turning to look at the aide. He was still looking at the gate at the absence. Then slowly, without rushing, he turned and walked back inside. The courtyard was quiet after that in the way that spaces go quiet when the main thing they were holding has left. The staff began to move. The children were guided gently toward warmth. The charity representatives gathered their coats and their private thoughts and began to find their way out through the gates. But several of them paused before leaving separately, without coordination, as though the same impulse moved through them individually, and looked back at the castle one more time. The gray sky had not changed. It was still heavy, still pale, still the color of mornings that carry more inside them than a simple description can hold. But something had happened in that courtyard on that Tuesday morning. Something that would not appear in any official record, but that mattered perhaps more than many of the things that do. Something that the people who were there would carry with them for a long time. The memory of a woman who had given enormous amounts of herself. For years, without complaint, without slowing, without ever appearing to count the cost, finally being given the space to stop. And the quiet and moving dignity with which she allowed herself to receive that space. Kate did not make her farewell dramatic. She did not make it about herself in the way that some might have, given everything she had contributed. She walked through that morning the same way she had walked through every morning of her public life, paying attention, giving people her full presence, making the small gestures that leave lasting impressions. She cried, but only for a second and only honestly. She smiled, but only when she genuinely felt it. She said goodbye to everyone who was there, and she meant every word of it. And King Charles, standing at the edge of a cold gray courtyard, hands held behind his back, eyes holding something soft and private and unperformed, he watched her go with the kind of pride that does not announce itself. The kind that simply stands steady in a courtyard on a Tuesday morning, making sure someone knows without needing to say it directly that they are not walking away into nothing, that they are walking into rest, into space, into the quiet life they had earned many times over and had never quite stopped long enough to receive. That was the farewell. That was what happened on that morning at Windsor. That was the morning King Charles stood in a courtyard with his hands behind his back and his eyes full of something real, and watched the woman who had carried so much finally set it down and walk away. Some goodbyes are endings, some are pauses. This one felt like both and neither at the same time. And everyone who was there understood without needing to be told that this was not the last of anything. It was, if anything, the most human moment any of them had witnessed in a place not always known for its humanity. She would come back. They all believed that. King Charles believed that, and that belief was not hope for its own sake. It was the steady, grounded certainty of people who had watched her and knew exactly what she was made of. But for now, she was gone. The courtyard was quiet. The sky stayed gray. And somehow, without anyone planning it that way, that felt exactly right.